Hello again, everybody, and another very warm welcome back to Skeptics in the Pub Online. We now have a fortnightly format, as you all know, because everyone is beginning to think at last of meeting up again in real life, in pubs, chatting, sharing drinks, and just getting back to normal. And it's a tantalising thing. So fortnightly is heading there. In the meantime, we are still meeting fortnightly, and welcome. Just a few usual housekeeping tips first. A reminder that if you would like to donate to us, the link will be underneath the screen. And also if you want to ask questions in the Slido tonight. Moving on to the main event, which I'm doing quite quickly today because I can hear barking in the background and it's stressing me out slightly. Sorry about that. We've got Faye Skelton, who's going to be talking to us tonight about when innocent becomes guilty, the psychology of false confessions. This looks to be a really interesting talk. I'm quite excited for it, actually. And Faye completed her PhD in face recognition at Lancaster University, and then she worked there for over 10 years at the University of Central Lancashire. After that, Faye moved to her current post of lecturer, and she's also a public speaker at Edinburgh Napier University, where she has a special interest in face perception, recognition and memory. She applies this mainly in the forensic field to cognitive, cultural and ethical aspects of the legal system. Faye's also investigating ways of improving police facial recognition composites, that are otherwise known as EFITs, in terms of how to recover information from memory, best practice for system use, and ways of improving recognition of the facial image, for instance, caricatures. Faye's also interested in miscarriages of justice. She's currently exploring experiences of wrongful imprisonment with Dr. Mandy Winterton on a British Academy Leverhulme-funded project. Finally, and slightly sideways, she's written and performed several shows for the Edinburgh Fringe, including Fitness to Witness, Suspect Confessions and Pants on Fire. So please put your hands together virtually and in real life, why not, for a very warm welcome for Dr. Faye Skelton. Faye, over to you.
Thank you, Cleo. Welcome, everyone. It would be nice to see your lovely faces, but alas, that's not where we are at the moment. So maybe one day soon in a pub near you. So as Cleo said, I have quite broad interests within the area of forensic psychology, really, psychology in the legal system. And I became interested in false confessions probably about 15 years ago when I was just asked to cover a lecture for a colleague. And like many people, around 95% of people, I thought, well, you'd never confess to something that you hadn't done, particularly if it was a really serious crime. You just wouldn't confess to a crime that you hadn't committed because the repercussions, the consequences are far too serious. And the vast majority of people think they would never do that. However, around 25% of wrongful convictions involve a false confession or a false admission of guilt. So it is a pretty significant factor in wrongful convictions, and it does contribute to people going to prison for crimes they haven't committed. Now, when we're talking about false confessions, this definition is what we're working with in psychology, really. So the confession is false if it's given in response to a demand for a confession. We never demand confessions, we shouldn't do that. And it's either intentionally fabricated or it's not based on actual knowledge of the facts. So there are a number of ways that false confessions can arise, and I'm going to go through these in the course of this talk. But first of all, how do we know whether a confession is false? Well, police officers and jurors can't distinguish true from false confessions. They're actually not much better than a layperson at detecting whether a confession is true or false. Similar to how well we can detect lies, for example. We're just not very good at it. So we need other ways of detecting that a confession is false. So firstly, if there's no evidence that a crime has been committed, that might be one way. But then some crimes you wouldn't necessarily expect to be able to find clear evidence, particularly if a long time had passed. Sometimes there'll be scientific evidence, so something like DNA evidence, which will exonerate the person that confessed and perhaps implicate somebody else known to the authorities. The real perpetrator might be apprehended by some other evidence. They might be linked to the crime. Also, sometimes the real perpetrator ends up in prison for something else and then says, oh, yeah, that was me as well. And there might be other non-scientific evidence that proves the confessor's innocence. So there's a number of ways that we might know that a confession that's been given isn't a true confession, but that doesn't always mean that the person who gave it is exonerated and set free. So there can be lifelong implications for people that falsely confess. So I'm going to look at 3 different types of false confession. The first is voluntary. And by voluntary, we mean that there's no demand from the social situation. There's no external pressure on the person to confess. There's coerced or pressured compliant. Coerced isn't a preferred term anymore because it suggests that people have been forced, whereas pressured is a little bit more along the lines of somebody might have been heavily persuaded. But in a coerced or pressured compliant confession, this is where somebody will provide a confession to get out of, for example, quite an unpleasant interrogation. And then once the interrogation or the interview is over, they will say, actually, I just did that to get out of the room. I didn't really do it. And they're not often believed. So there is that. And the third kind of false confession is coerced or pressured internalized. And this is really serious because this is where the person, the innocent person, actually becomes convinced of their guilt. And they genuinely believe that they have committed the crime that they've confessed to. That might only be temporary, but for a period of time, they believe that they committed what is often a horrendous crime. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn. So turning first to voluntary false confessions. So these are false confessions that are given without any external pressure, no demand from anybody else on the person to confess. And a couple of examples you might be aware of. Charles Lindbergh Jr., I think was a 2-year-old boy, was son of the famous aviator, was kidnapped in 1932. I think it was March 1932. I think his body was found around May time. And the investigation went on till 1934. Over the period of the investigation, around 200 people confessed to kidnapping and killing the baby. And obviously, they were false. And the real perpetrator, or the person we believe is the real perpetrator, was convicted and sentenced to death the following year. JonBenet Ramsey, a more recent case probably you've heard of. She was known as being like a beauty queen. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that term for a young child, or any child, in fact. But she took part in beauty pageants. She vanished from her home. I think there were a number of different kind of ransom notes and letters left. And 10 years later, a man named John Mark Carr contacted the police and said that he and JonBenet Ramsey actually had a physical relationship, and he had murdered her, or rather he'd killed her accidentally. But the DNA evidence that the police had ruled him out, and so thankfully he wasn't wrongfully convicted. As far as I'm aware, they've not caught the real perpetrator, and there's some discussion around, was it the parents, wasn't it the parents, as you do get with these things. So a couple of examples there of people who have volunteered confessions without any external pressure to do so. They've not been interrogated. They've come forward to the police and said, yes, I did this. So it sounds ridiculous. You probably can think of no situation in which you would ever do that. But there are some people who just want to be famous. Some people want to protect the guilty person. So a parent, for example, might step forward to protect a child. Or people might confess to one thing to relieve guilt for something else that they've got away with. Talking about people with a desire for fame, there was a very famous person in the United States called Henry Lee Lucas. And he confessed to something like 600 murders, many of which there was no evidence had ever been committed. But he had a desire to be notorious. He liked the police attention that he got. When they kind of chatted with him in the interrogation, he could have a coffee and a cigarette with them. And it was quite pally. Really liked that attention. Some research conducted with people in prisons shows that those that have been actively involved in criminal activity are more likely to falsely confess. So this study by Sigurdsson and Gudjonsson, these were Icelandic prison inmates, and 12% of them claimed to have given at least one confession to the police. There's also people who have a lessened grip on reality, so what we call impaired reality monitoring. And they don't necessarily, they can't reliably distinguish between what's real and what isn't real. So that might come about, for example, through a mental illness, or it might come about through, overuse of certain substances. But if you can't distinguish what's real from not, you're perhaps less certain about what you did and what you didn't do. And there's also some evidence that some people with obsessive compulsive disorder have enhanced feelings of responsibility for harm coming to other people. And these sort of faulty appraisals of responsibility might lead them to confess to crimes that they haven't committed. So a number of different reasons there as to why somebody might voluntarily confess to a crime that they haven't committed. Moving on to look at coerced or pressured compliant. I've got a quote here. I recollect him, one of the police officers, describing at least one of the defendants being taken into a room, being taken to a window, accompanied by a suggestion that he could be thrown out. I recollect him saying that he held a gun to the heads of more than one of the defendants. He said it was an unloaded gun and that he had pulled the trigger. I remember him gleefully relating terror on the faces, I'm sure it was in the plural, when he did this. So this is a quote from a detective constable with Lancashire CID, and I believe that this was about the Birmingham Six case. So probably all of you will have heard of the Birmingham Six, and probably to a perhaps not as well known but very similar cases, the Guildford Four and the Tottenham Three. So these are cases in the 1970s where police were a little bit more free and easy with their interviewing. We didn't have the guidelines that we do now, and there were what we would call third degree techniques where people were kept without water. They might be beaten. Certainly if you've ever heard Paddy Hill from the Birmingham Six speak, I was fortunate enough to see him at the Fringe a few years ago. The things that he experienced under interrogation from the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad were absolutely horrendous. So mock executions, threats to hurt loved ones, the worst pressure that you can think of. And so a number of the Birmingham Six, but importantly not all of the Birmingham Six, a number of them provided confessions, even though they were innocent of the pub bombing. Similar with the Guildford Four, the Tottenham Three. Stefan Kishko, I think I know this case quite well because I grew up in Rochdale, and this is a case that happened in Rochdale. So a young girl called Leslie Molseed was murdered in the 70s, and Stefan Kishko was interviewed and came to give a confession. After denying that he'd been involved, he came to confess to her murder. And I think it took his mum something like 17 years of campaigning to get him out of prison, to get him exonerated. And then, you know, within a few months of him being released, she died and then he died, which is awful. And a more recent case, Brendan Dassey. So those of you that are familiar with the Making a Murderer Netflix series and the case of Stephen Avery, Brendan Dassey. Brendan Dassey is Stephen Avery's younger nephew, who allegedly had some part to play in the assault and murder of Teresa Holbach. But there are all sorts of red flags around that case, and this is an ongoing case. So a few there that you may well have heard of. So what goes wrong in these cases? And again, there are a number of things, or it's perhaps more easy to see why somebody might confess under this sort of pressure. So in a number of these cases, there was evidence that the police had colluded, that they'd altered suspect statements, that they'd suppressed evidence that proved the innocence of the suspects. Stefan Kishko was a vulnerable adult. He had learning difficulties. Brendan Dassey was a minor, so he was 16 when he was interviewed, and he has a low IQ. They should have been interviewed with a solicitor present. Now they'd need to be interviewed as well with an appropriate adult present, but this didn't happen. So you've got people perhaps with a lesser understanding of the consequences of the situation, or a lesser understanding of the severity of the situation, being treated like regular adults and being subjected to that kind of pressure. Not so much now, hopefully not now, certainly not in the UK now, but we had third degree tactics. So people alleged that the police beat them, threatened to hurt their families, carried out mock executions. And so all of these external pressures create a situation that is so unpleasant, a situation where the suspect can't see a way that they can get out of that situation unless they give the police what they want. And so they cave in, they get out of the interrogation room, the interview room, and think, well, I'll be able to retract it. Evidence will exonerate me. We'll figure it out, but first I have to get out of this room. Because a lot of these high profile cases in the 1970s, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act came in 1984, which had quite strict guidelines about what was and what was not allowed. And we've made a lot of developments even since then in terms of how we interview suspects, and I will come to that later on. But I think it's easy to see in these situations how the situation could become so unpleasant that confessing might seem your only way out. But some people are more vulnerable than others. So just going on to look at some of the individual factors. One of the first ones is suggestibility. So this is a concept described by Gisliger Johnson. And suggestibility concerns a person's vulnerability to leading questions. So going along with a question that suggests the answer. And also their vulnerability to changing their answers when they are prompted to change their answers. Or, if you're told, do you want to have a go at answering those questions again and try to get more of them right this time? Or, that's what I was looking for. Do you want to try again? So people who are more suggestible will be more vulnerable to going along with giving the answers that police are demanding, or that police seem to want. So out of the Birmingham Six, The ones who did falsely confess scored higher in suggestibility than the ones that didn't. And there's even recent research evidence from Henry Utgar's lab that high levels of suggestibility are significantly associated with increased likelihood of false confession. A related concept, but a different concept, is that of compliance. Compliance is a less significant factor in false confessions, but it does still contribute. Compliance is the extent to which you try and avoid conflict, and you please people because you want to avoid conflict. So it's easy to see, I think, how in a really unpleasant, pressured interrogation where the police are telling you that you've done something wrong, that you've answered the question wrong, they might be shouting at you. You want to get out of that situation. You want to give them what they want. You want to avoid any sort of conflict. And so that might enhance your susceptibility to confessing to something that you haven't done. And fantasy proneness is another one. So people who have, as I say, a lessened grip on reality, people who are more prone to kind of wandering off mentally, not quite connected to where they are now, imagining alternative versions of events. And I'll come back to that in a little while. There's also, if you have a low IQ or a learning disability or mental illness, and also there's some evidence that youths, and particularly young men, are much more vulnerable. And Lindsay Malloy does a really good TED talk on this. So, the role of age in false confessions. But these groups typically have a lesser understanding of the situation that they're in and of the consequences of what's happening. They typically will be more suggestible and more compliant, and they'll be more vulnerable to social influence, and they'll be likely more intimidated by the situation. So if you think about, a regular person with average IQ, no known learning disabilities, you're put into a police interrogation, and there's all of this pressure on you. It's really unpleasant. People start shouting at you. People start demanding certain answers of you. You're going to feel threatened. You're going to feel intimidated. Now, imagine if you've got a low IQ or a learning disability or a mental illness. That is just going to enhance those feelings of vulnerability and intimidation. In terms of situational factors, we can take a closer look at what actually happens during the interview. So there are particular techniques that might be used. There's recent publications that show that really there's not much evidence that these sorts of things are happening in the UK anymore, but we know that these sorts of things are happening in other parts of the world. So police can give put pressure on via maximisation and minimisation techniques. So by maximisation techniques, we mean in the interview, they might say things like, we've got really strong evidence that you did this. It's a really serious crime. The judge and the jury are absolutely going to have no sympathy with you whatsoever. You're going away for a really long time. But if you confess, we might be able to lessen the sentence. In the States, I believe it's still legal to lie about evidence. So the police might say, that lie detector test you took, you failed it, as much as anyone can fail a test that doesn't detect lies. But they can claim that they've got DNA evidence from you when they haven't. So you can imagine how somebody might come to believe that, actually, it's not looking very good for me. And maybe if I plead guilty, I'll get away with something a little bit less bad. But they can also apply minimisation techniques. Minimization techniques might be things like victim blaming. So, come on, he'd had a go at your missus. He was asking for it. He provoked you. Anybody in your situation would have done exactly the same. You just lashed out in the heat of the moment. The judge, the jury will absolutely understand that. So all you need to do really is confess that you've done it, and you'll get a lesser sentence. So these two techniques work in different ways, but the ultimate aim is the same, and it's to get people to confess. The suspect might be tired, they might be hungry, and they might be afraid. So in the UK, we do have limits about how long people can be questioned for, and they must have breaks. But even a couple of hours of being questioning, you're probably needing a drink, exhausted, can't remember what you said 20 minutes ago, excuse me. It's a really scary situation. It's also probably quite an unfamiliar situation. If most of us found ourselves in this situation, I think it would be unfamiliar for the vast majority of us. And so you don't really know what's going on, and this can overwhelm you cognitively. So ultimately, people either don't understand the consequences of what's happening, or they think that the short-term benefit of confessing and getting out of the interview outweighs the long-term costs. Essentially, confession is the best way forward. That's the logical step for them. And it's bizarre to think that people get to that point, but plenty of people do get to that point. There's also subtle things like the type of question that's asked. So that we have open questions, we have closed questions. So open questions invite somebody to give a free answer. They can tell you what they know about whatever it is you're asking about. A closed question invites really a yes or no answer. It doesn't really give you opportunity to clarify or to justify or to give caveats or anything like that. And then we have leading questions, which are essentially prompting the suspect in a particular direction. So in this example, tell me what happened at the King's Head on the evening of October the 31st. The presumption there is that the person was in that pub on that date, but they might not have been. They might have been in the pub not on that date. They might have never been in that pub. But the way that the question's worded means that if the person answers, it's almost like they're kind of going along with the question. They're kind of admitting that they were in the pub on that night. So if you say, well, I don't know, then that doesn't tell anybody that you don't know that you weren't there on that day. This is an example of or it's a very, very short segment of an interview of Brendan Dassey, so from the Making a Murderer case. So at this point, you can actually find these transcripts online if you've not seen them. They are available, and I think the recordings of some of his interviews are actually on YouTube. At this point, the officers have worn Brendan down, so he's denied that he had anything to do with this murder. He's denied that he even saw the woman, but they've got him to a point where he's talking about a fire pit out on the family's land, but the family have like a car sales yard and there's a junkyard part of that, and so regularly there would be bits of cars and tires and rubbish burning. And what the officers are doing here is, you can see all that Brendan says is toes and I seen. But at the end of this segment, one of the officers is saying the body parts that you saw, were they on top of the tyres or underneath the tyres? And in context, you can see how Brendan's never told them at all that he saw a body within this fire. They've presented that information to him. And when he said, no, I haven't seen that, well, we don't believe you. What did you see? So they've pushed him into this situation, nudging him further and further down this direction, until eventually, Brendan is essentially admitted to taking part in the assault and murder of Teresa Holbach, and that's why he's still in prison. Now, the really scary, as if the last one wasn't scary enough, the really scary kind of false confession is where somebody actually might come to believe that they committed the crime. And there's a couple of examples of that. So the quote here, I'm not sure how I did it. All I know is I did it. I think Michael Crowe came to believe that he'd stabbed his sister to death after police told him that there was evidence that proved his guilt. There wasn't, and thankfully they found the real perpetrator and the charges against him were dropped, but many people aren't that lucky. So there's a couple of cases here, really bizarre cases. You almost can't believe that they happened. So Paul Ingram was a church minister who was accused of abusing his daughters. And over a period of 5 months, he was interrogated 23 times. This included being hypnotized by a member of his church. So they hypnotized him. They told him that Satan distorted his memory, that sex offenders often repress memories of their crimes. And through hypnosis, managed to get Paul Ingram to kind of generate tales about all these crimes he'd committed. So as well as abusing his daughters, he admitted to murdering infants in satanic rituals, crimes for which there was absolutely no evidence. He attempted to retract his guilty plea. So although he did believe that he'd committed these crimes, after he was out of the pressure of those kind of continued interrogations, he realised that he hadn't done it. But he served 20 years in prison. Now, like, hypnosis is pretty dodgy. In my personal opinion, it is pretty dodgy. The British Psychological Society say that if you are going to use hypnosis, it should never be used to try and recover memories that the person doesn't seem to have any knowledge of. So if somebody has knowledge of something and they might want to get more knowledge of that thing, there is a possibility that hypnosis could be helpful. But if somebody says, I never did that, I have no memory that that happened, you don't hypnotize them to try and get them to remember it. Because once they're in that state, it's a lot easier to take on suggestions and then to have false memories. The second case, Billy Wayne Cope, another bizarre case. His daughter was raped and murdered in 2001, but there was no evidence that anyone had broken into the house. And so the police said, well, you were in the house, you must have done it. And they said he didn't look distressed enough when he called the police. He didn't seem distressed enough. And they got DNA evidence and it didn't match him. So you'd think, brilliant, that exonerates him then. But they found a match to the DNA evidence, and they identified the person that had left the DNA at the scene. And they concocted this story whereby Billy Wayne Cope was in cahoots with this man that he'd never met, and he'd allowed this man to come into the house and rape and murder his daughter. They got him to, reenact at the scene of the crime his part in the crime. He offered to take a lie detector test, which he did, and they told him he'd failed the lie detector test. And he very sadly died in prison in 2017, and his wife died from, I think, complications from surgery, believing that her husband had murdered their daughter. So absolutely horrendous. These are both cases from the United States, and I think they're quite extreme cases. But, some people don't have confidence in their memory, or they're not as connected to reality. And so perhaps they are more susceptible to having their reality distorted, to taking on suggestions, to internalising those suggestions and remembering things that didn't happen. And there are additional risk factors for this. So there are some people who have what's called memory distrust syndrome. This is people who don't really have a lot of confidence in their own memory. So they feel their internal cues of what they remember are unreliable. So they tend to rely on external cues instead. So if they hear suggestions from other people, or if they hear snippets of other people's accounts, they're likely to attach more weight to those than they would to their own memory. People who are dissociated have a lesser connection with reality, and so it might be easier to think that something that's not real is real, or to not be quite so firmly planted in what is real. Dissociation is actually something that we all experience. So if you're a driver and you've ever driven from A to B and arrive at place B and have no recollection how you've got there, that's an example of dissociation. And it comes with knowing the journey and kind of doing things automatically. Another example is like, if you walk into a room and you forget why you've gone into the room, which I do at least daily. These are markers of dissociation. There's a particular kind of dissociation index, but these are all examples. Reading a page of a book and actually not being able to recall a single sentence that you've read. They're all indicators of not quite being connected to what's going on at the moment. But some people are more dissociated than others. Humans are typically not brilliant at source monitoring. So we might know that we know something, but we might not be able to tell where the information came from. So I've had examples where I've gone to the office and told a colleague something that's happened, and then a couple of months later they've said, oh yeah, I was talking to my friend last week and they told me this. And I know that I'm the person that told them, but they've forgotten that it was me that told them. The problem with poor source monitoring is we don't know whether an item of information has come from our memory, or particularly our original memory of the event, or whether it's been incorporated into our memory by reading something in a newspaper, seeing something on TV, hearing another witness's version of events, imagining that something might have happened differently. So these are all ways that, alterations in memory can happen, but we don't necessarily know that they're not part of the originally encoded event. We don't know where to attribute them to. And particularly salient to the Paul Ingram case is that if you have repeated interviews or interrogations, and particularly where you might be asked to think about alternative versions of events, or you're told that you did something, this increases the familiarity, the salience of that information, and the confidence that it actually happened. So repeated interviewing is it can be helpful in some respects, because being interviewed can recover information, and once that information's been recovered, that kind of serves to rehearse it, and you might be then more likely to recall it later on. But if any false information gets in there, you're also more likely to recall that false information later on, and to be more confident that that false information is accurate. So it is a tricky one. Now, we can even look at false confessions in lab studies. So this particular case by Sol Cassin and his colleagues, they had a lab set up where they had participants come along to the lab, and they were asked to type letters into a computer keyboard and these letters would be read out to them at either a slow or a fast rate. So they were told, whatever you do, don't press the Alt key. If you press the Alt key, the computer will crash, all the data will be lost, you'll have ruined our experiment, and it's going to be the end of the world. So the participants get away with typing in the keys. The computer, of course, is timed to crash, and they're then told, well, you must have pressed the Alt key. And for some of those participants, there was a confederate of the researcher in the room who said, oh, yeah, I saw you press the Alt key. And the participants were asked to sign a confession. So they had to say, yes, I pressed the Alt key. And when they left the room, they were asked by somebody outside the room who was another confederate but posing as another participant. They were asked what all the commotion was about. And this research showed that the more difficult task, so where they were typing at a fast rate and they were perhaps more likely to make errors, and where somebody else claimed they'd seen them press the Alt key, this increased the rates of confession, of internalisation, so saying, well, I must have done it, and confabulation, which was measured by, to what extent they concocted a story to tell the person waiting outside. And this research was kind of critiqued as well. There's not really any cost to it. So, if there's no consequences, so what? But it has been reproduced, and the findings reproduced even when there's a financial cost. So even when people lost, I think it was $10, these factors are still important in confession, internalisation, and confabulation. So this sort of research, it seems fairly innocuous, but it's quite difficult to do false confession research in an ethical way. And you can do ecologically valid false confession research in an ethical way. So there's not heaps of lab research because, it's not considered acceptable to trick people into confessing to things they haven't done, or even worse, getting them to believe that they've done something that they haven't done. But this is just one example of how it has been done. This is another example. So this particular study by Marianne Gary and her colleagues, they had participants come along to the lab and they completed what's called a life events inventory. And they rated these different life events for the likelihood that they'd experienced them themselves. 2 weeks later, they were invited back to the lab and they were told to imagine some of the events happening in as much detail as possible. So who was there with you? What happened? Can you remember the sequence of events? So really to imagine in great detail how some of these things might have happened. And they were asked to imagine events that hadn't happened to them. They were then asked to complete the life events inventory again. So they were told that the original one had been misplaced. Please could you complete it again? And what they found was that the events that had been imagined, the participants actually were more confident that those events had actually happened to them, whereas previously they'd been very confident those events hadn't happened to them. So this is the idea of imagination inflation, where we imagine things being different, we imagine things happening, and that imagining essentially becomes a version of the event. And it becomes accessible to us in some cases as a memory, as a false memory, but still it's quite risky. And you can see how this might be very dangerous when combined with things like hypnosis and repeated interviewing. So if you're asked to imagine or consider alternative versions of events time and time again, over a period of weeks or a period of months, you can probably see how somebody might shift from being really convinced that something didn't happen to, maybe it did actually happen. I'm not so sure anymore. Not going to dwell too much on this, but across the pond, thankfully now the read technique, which you can read all about online, the read technique is now being moved away from in a number of states. It's being held up as an example of bad practice in a number of places, and so it looks like the US are kind of shifting away from this technique. But this technique asks the officers. It's basically it brags about its proportion of confessions. That is a problem to start with, because the aim of an interview should never be to get a confession. It should be to get information that leads to solving the crime. The confession should never be your aim. But the read technique starts off with some initial questions asked of the suspect, and officers, on the basis of the suspect's answers to those questions and how they've behaved, decide whether they're innocent or guilty. Based on, do they look a bit shifty or do they look all right? And then what happens is, if they've decided they look a bit shifty, the interrogation that follows presumes guilt. It doesn't really give them opportunity to make any denials, or it cuts off any denials. And the focus is very much on, narrowing the suspect down to a confession. And that might involve lying about evidence. It might involve maximisation or minimisation techniques. A variety of kind of deceptive and underhand tactics to get a confession. But once you've got a confession, the case is solved, so everyone's happy, right? There's also what are called enhanced interrogation techniques, which is a slightly more pleasant way of saying torture. And you can read about these online. There's nothing enhanced about them. It's basically, waterboarding, keeping people in stress positions, subjecting them to horrendous noise, depriving them of sleep. It's all part of the enhancement. And the Mr. Big technique, which is, it's illegal in the US, but I think still possible to use in Canada. This is a kind of covert investigative technique whereby people are kind of tricked into giving confessions in cold cases. So some fairly shifty stuff going on there. And in this research, it showed that detectives in North America were more likely than not to pretend to have evidence of somebody's guilt, to isolate them from their support network, to try and gain their trust, which on its own isn't a bad thing. But when you gain their trust to manipulate them, that's not so good. Appeal to their self-interest, offer sympathy, etc. So really iffy practices. So how should suspects be interviewed? Well, we have within the UK what's called the Peace framework. This is promoted by the Home Office, and within Scotland we have the Price framework, which is essentially the same, which involves planning. The planning is to get information from everybody who's been interviewed, establishing rapport with the person that's been interviewed, which means engaging them in the purpose of the interview, trying to speak to them on a level that they can understand, trying to find some common ground, explaining what the purpose of the interview is. The interview itself has a number of what we call mnemonics to try and enhance people's memory. So give them the opportunity to recall everything. So completely free recall without being interrupted. Mental reinstatement of the context, which can be the physical context of the crime, the emotional context, what they could hear, what they could smell, etc. Changing the order of recall and changing the perspective. So trying to think about what they might have seen if they'd been stood somewhere else. And these are both ways that research has shown we can tap into different memory traces. And so they might trigger something in one trace that wasn't available via another. So this kind of cognitive approach to interviewing does rely on having a cooperative suspect or cooperative witness, but is very good at getting accurate information from people. There's then the kind of the closure phase of the interview where people are thanked and they're it's explained to them what happens next. Can they be expected to be contacted again, and so on. And then the officers will go away and evaluate the information that's been gathered and work out where the gaps are and so on. And this outline by Shepherd just really highlights the importance of ethical interviewing. So the focus should be on getting as complete an account of the event as possible. We don't presume that anybody's guilty. The interviewee is a participant in the conversation. They're not a suspect. They have a very important part to play. And if somebody's resistant to confessing or resistant to giving information, it doesn't necessarily mean they're guilty. It might mean that everything's moving too quickly and they can't keep up. The interviewer's not listening to them, suggesting things that aren't true, or that they're being interrupted. So somebody being uncooperative doesn't necessarily indicate that they're guilty. And so these are the principles now by which we're supposed to be interviewing. And we have come a very, very long way in the past 30 odd years in terms of our interviewing. And the UK now is actually held up as an example of good practice in terms of ethical interviewing. But, false confessions do still happen. It's really important, actually, because once you introduce a confession, any other evidence kind of becomes irrelevant. So if somebody has confessed to a crime that they haven't committed, it's almost like it doesn't matter what the other evidence is, because we still overwhelmingly believe that innocent people don't confess to crimes they haven't committed. So some research by Drizzen and Leo showed that 81% of false confessors who went to trial were convicted. And even where the jury are told that the confession was pressured or coerced, where they're told that the confession is therefore inadmissible and they shouldn't pay any attention to it, they were still likely to convict, and they claimed that the confession didn't affect their decision. So they were very much influenced by it, but didn't seem to be aware, or certainly didn't want to admit that it had affected their decision making. So minimising false confessions, well, video recording of interviews helps, because first of all, it might give anybody with, untoward tendencies towards going for a confession, it might make them think again. But also it means that we've got a recording of the process, and that recording can be reviewed, and any problematic aspects of the interview can be picked up. Audio recording has been in place since 1984 in the UK. So this is one way that we're able to at least detect them, if not prevent them. Investigative interviewing, so similar to what I've outlined, is an ethical way of interviewing. It's much better than interrogating, which is a guilt presumptive, pressured way of interviewing. We do have increased awareness of why particular people might be vulnerable and how those vulnerabilities might interact with characteristics of the interview. And also in Scotland, we have a requirement for corroboration of evidence, although that is a controversial thing in itself. And so I guess the end message is, when a suspect is being questioned, they might actually think that falsely confessing is the rational thing to do. And some people are particularly at risk due to the interaction of their individual characteristics and characteristics of the situation. And so, psychology is doing a really good job, but we need to pay a lot more attention to the factors that increase the risk of them. And that is me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for a really, really scary talk. I was listening to that thinking I can just hear myself going, oh, for goodness sake, all right, then I did it. you can imagine how easy it is to do that. So yes, I shall need a drink before we meet up again. So before we close for a break, just a reminder that we'll be meeting in the pub afterwards. There will be links to that in the chat. And if you haven't asked any questions, do head over to SITP online/ask to either ask some more questions or to upvote the questions that you like. One more thing before we finish. We've just a reminder about next fortnight's talk. That will be by Ian Keeble, and he's going to be talking to us about A Century of Deception, the birth of the hoax in 18th century England. And from what I can see, it may be a little lighter than tonight, because one of the things he's talking about is a woman who could apparently give birth to rabbits. So we are meeting again at 8:10. So please go and refresh your drinks, think about questions, and I look forward to seeing you again later. Thank you. Hi, welcome back everyone. I hope you've all got refreshed glasses and that none of you need a wee anymore, and it's just really nice to see you back. So we've got some really good questions. As with all the best talks, it was really quiet, and then suddenly all your questions have been tumbling out during the break. So we'll get straight into them. And the first one I'm going to mention rather than ask, I have to say, is can we see your pets? Now, the reason for that is because Faye has 2 cats with her. One of them is apparently off his tits on catnip and not likely to be available. The other one may be in and out. So rather than try and grab him now, what we've had is a promise that if a cat sort of hoves into view, we'll get to meet him. So that's pets. And I can, looking at the questions, Igor has been really very busy, and everyone likes Igor's questions. So his first one here is, given that human memory is basically rubbish and that it's very easy to deepfake any video, what will happen to the judicial system in future?
That is a really good question, and one that I have no idea what the answer is, because well, I mean, I think, yeah, if you can deep fake videos, then you can produce false evidence, which might implicate people. In fact, there was a really good series on TV last year, and I can't for the life of me remember what it was called, but it was very good, and it was about deep fake video and implicating someone in something horrendous. I think it's just going to become more and more difficult to establish what is real evidence and what is false evidence. And I'm technically terrible. I don't know whether there will be any way in which the magical wizards that understand these kinds of things are able to determine what has been tinkered with and what hasn't been tinkered with. But I think it's going to get a lot more difficult. And the thing is, if it's more difficult to kind of deep fake videos, you also get trial by social media, whereby these things get circulated. People will believe pretty much anything you post on Facebook, for example. I know young people don't use Facebook anymore, but I'm not young. So people post crap on Facebook, stick a caption on it, and everyone circulates it as though it's real without actually checking anything. So I think with, fake video evidence, these kinds of media frenzies are going to get worse, and obviously that brings pressure with it as well. That brings pressure on the police if the public are up in arms. So I don't have the answer, but there are some of my ponderings.
Right. I mean, we have some of these wizards. They are our tech guys, so I suppose that's a question we could put back to them at some time. They might, they really might know more about it than we do. The next question comes from Parrot Lady, and she asks, how is mental capacity assessed before an interview, and who makes the decision on an individual's capacity, especially when it comes to learning difficulties?
This is a really good question. So within the UK, the people that are involved in dealing with a suspect or dealing with a witness should have some training or some knowledge of what to look for in terms of assessing whether somebody is is fit to be questioned as is, or whether they might need some additional support. If they are assessed as needing additional support, then we do have special measures that can be put in place. If someone's going to court, we have things that can be done with the courtroom. Vulnerable witnesses, vulnerable suspects should have somebody with them. Everyone should have a solicitor, but some might have an appropriate adult as well, somebody that knows them or knows when they might need a rest. But as you can imagine, there is quite a lot of variability in the extent to which this is done. And I can't remember the complications, but I think that there are difficulties in funding these measures. And I can't remember whether they have to be funded by the particular particular station or particular location that the police are in, or whether it comes from a bigger pot. I can't get into it too much, but the provision of special measures and the provision of support for vulnerable people is something that needs a lot more attention, because it can be done, but it is not done consistently. And a lot of vulnerable people are left without support that they need.
So Dave, who's managing Slido today, has found another question which is very similar but slightly different, so it's worth asking them together. And that's, are there systems to protect impressionable, neurodiverse or psychologically unstable people or other vulnerable people from coerced false impressions?
The way would be just to make sure that they've got an appropriate adult with them, trying to make the questioning simple. So questions can be very convoluted. There can be questions embedded within other questions. So there's good practice that can be followed. So make sure people have breaks, make sure that people, for example, understand the difference between a truth and a lie. Making sure that people understand whether something is real and not real. Making sure that they have support, and that might be from a member of the family, it might be from a social worker, but someone that can look out for their welfare. Make sure they get breaks. Make sure that they're not pressured externally. But of course, they might still be vulnerable to confessing, even where there isn't that external pressure.
So would these things that you're suggesting, would they be only for people who'd been deemed vulnerable? Or is that the reason I ask that is because I've certainly seen papers showing that a ridiculous proportion of people are capable of vivid memories of things they haven't done, and that's not emotionally vulnerable. So is it just the vulnerable who are supported, or would it be the likes of us if we turned up, who I reckon we're probably just as potentially as vulnerable as they are to remembering things we haven't done?
You would need to be assessed as being vulnerable. So vulnerable in, of kind of a lesser cognitive capacity to understand the situation and to understand what you're being asked. So they don't do suggestibility tests and then go, this person's quite suggestible, we'll get someone in to make sure that they're not going along with suggestions. It would be people with a lessened grip on reality, people who perhaps, for example, people who are in particular phases of schizophrenia, people who have other mental illnesses, people who have a low IQ. It would be those people that don't have a grasp of what's going on and really what the consequences are and how serious it is. So we're talking children and what we would know as vulnerable adults. As you say, rightly, most of us would be vulnerable to this kind of pressure in an interview situation. But those sorts of mechanisms, if they are in place, would be put in for people that are clearly vulnerable. But as I said, it's not really consistently done even for them.
You're just making me more and more scared about the whole thing. I hope I'm never arrested for something I've not done and can't prove it. It's really scary. Igor, another question from him, who asks, are they still using unscientific means of interrogation, like lie detectors, to coerce people? And should we do something about it if they are?
So in the UK, we don't use lie detector evidence, it's not admissible as far as I'm aware. However, there has been, over the past couple of years, discussions of probation services using it, checking that people aren't reoffending and using it in that kind of context, which, lie detectors do not exist. That they don't detect lies. It's a whole other talk entirely, but methods for detecting deception don't actually detect deception. And so it isn't a technology. Even the newer technologies like MRI and so-called brain fingerprinting, they're not even reliable mechanisms. They're still not detecting lies. So no, we shouldn't be using them. My understanding is that in other parts of the world, yes, lie detectors are used. They may be used as evidence. And no, they should absolutely not be used as evidence. There is now a lot of empirical research that shows they do not detect lies. They're unreliable. They I think give more false positives than false negatives. And again, there's different ways, different questioning techniques that you might use with a polygraph, for example, but they're unreliable, and they absolutely should not be admissible as evidence. And they certainly shouldn't be admissible as any sort of evidence on their own. Yeah, absolutely not.
Right, thank you. So sticking with Russia, quite more questions coming from Russia. Nadia here asks, are practices like meditation helpful in improving dissociation and further making yourself less vulnerable to questioning methods?
That is a really good question, and I don't know. Because I think there is a kind of an idea that meditation is kind of dissociating, but it's not, is it? It's about being very present in the moment and being connected to what's going on now. So I don't know how kind of meditation and sort of mindfulness would interact with those sorts of variables. I don't know of any research that's done it. There probably is some, but I'm not aware of it. But I will actually make a note to kind of go away and have a read up on that. I'm sorry I don't have the answer for you just now.
It does, yeah, it's fascinating. If there isn't any research, there should be. And sticking with dissociation then, Garnet, who is fascinated by the idea of dissociation, asks, is it a transient state or can it be protracted or even permanent?
Dissociation for most of us is we become more or less dissociated. So there will be days when I'm able to focus on a chapter of a book and remember what's been written, and days when I can't. And there'll be times within that day when I'm more or less aware of what's going on. And I think that is normal for everyone. So we're all vulnerable to dissociation, but our levels of dissociation will fluctuate. That said, there are some people who may be who may spend more time in a dissociative state, or for whom the dissociation is more pronounced. So, for example, people with schizophrenia who are suffering from delusions are dissociated from reality, in that they're experiencing these other things as real. So there will be individual differences within the individual, but also between individuals. Essentially, it's a kind of a disconnecting of conscious awareness. So if we think of it like that, then yes, it would be possible to be permanently dissociated if you had a disorder of consciousness. But people with disorders of consciousness are not generally sort of walking around and being interviewed. So I think for most of us who might end up in this situation, it's a kind of fluctuating thing.
Right. Yeah, I always think of dissociation as that coming round in the car where you've been quite happily driving and thinking, where am I? I don't recognise this. And then say, oh, there I am, I'm halfway home. But I can't imagine, it would be awful to be in that state for longer than that, because it's quite disconcerting, isn't it? Another question from Igor. So we've gone from Portsmouth back to Russia. Is the classic advice of never talk to the police without your lawyer applicable outside the US?
I would always say this, and I've said this before now at when I did this show in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and actually when I did it at the Edinburgh Fringe, and people always come back with, but if you say you want a lawyer, that suggests that you've got something to hide. It makes you look guilty. But sensibly, I know that you should not talk to the police unless you've got a lawyer, because once you've started giving those answers, it's very difficult to stop. You can find yourself kind of in a position where it's then difficult to get out of the situation. So I myself am quite compliant, and if a police officer said, can we just ask you a couple of questions, I'd probably go, oh yeah, of course you can, because I know I've done nothing wrong and I've got nothing to hide. But in my head, I know that what is it about? If I have to come to the station, that's absolutely fine, and I'll make sure I've got a lawyer, because a lawyer has experience of being in that situation. They will have experience of how interviews go, and things that have happened that I won't know about, and they will be much better able to advise me than my panicky brain.
Right, and just so that I'm set up for this future arrest I've just started anticipating, does that hold even if you're not being questioned under caution? So if they just say, can we ask you some questions, you're not under arrest, is that still no comment? Or
I think it depends on what they're asking you questions about. So if you're under caution, absolutely, no, I would say don't answer any questions without a solicitor present. If it's just a passing police officer who wants to know whether you saw something, then I would probably be less inclined to insist on a solicitor. But if you're under caution, I would absolutely insist.
Right, thanks. So I'm getting all that now. I'm prepared.
You're going to go out and do something now, aren't you? You're so racked with guilt already.
No, it needs to be for something I've not done. That's the point. I don't know how you organise that. Monica asks, and my contact lenses are furring up. Oh, here we go. She said, you said that interrogations got better in the UK, but are police forces' interrogation techniques checked and evaluated regularly, and by whom? And are they really better?
So there's been a lot more collaboration over recent years between academics and police, and the majority of police officers I've ever spoken to, and the ones I'm knowledgeable about, don't want false confessions. They actually want to find out what's happened because they want to solve the crime. If somebody falsely confesses, you probably get a load of crap further down the line, and it looks really bad. And I've certainly been in situations where the audience have disagreed with me, but I believe that the majority of police officers and police interviewers want to get information from witnesses. They want to get information from suspects, and they don't want to bully innocent people into confessing. And I may be called naive, but that's what I believe. And the research that we've got coming out of the UK, so there is academic research where they've collaborated with police departments, they've had access to recordings of interviews, recordings of videos, and they've said these coercive tactics that I've talked about are almost non-existent now. So yes, you can question, well, what was the sample? Who decided what videos they were allowed to watch? Who's monitoring them? I understand that the police do checks. So they will have people checking that nothing untoward has happened. As to how regular that will happen, I'm unable to say. But I do think we are a lot better in the UK than we've been in the past. And, I have to believe that. It's still not perfect at all, and miscarriages of justice are still absolutely happening. So there's still a long way to go.
So Dave's doing a really good job here of picking up questions that are linked. So we're still on police questioning here, and it's a question he asked himself. He says, is there any data on countries where compliance is more expected than in the UK, countries with less freedom?
There probably is some data. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but certainly where you've got cultures where it's less acceptable to question authority, and it is more the norm to go along with the majority, it would be something quite interesting to look at, confession rates. But I don't know off the top of my head.
Right. But the advice is get arrested in the UK rather than somewhere. Fine.
Yeah, the UK, possibly Norway or Australia.
Right.
Because I think Norway and Australia are using similar sorts of models to the ones we're using.
Sadly, very few countries by the sound of that. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly don't get arrested in, anywhere near Guantanamo Bay.
So Chromium 52 asks, should we have a justice system where a guilty plea doesn't automatically mean conviction, but evidence still needs to be evaluated by a full trial?
Yes, is the short answer. I don't think that a guilty plea should mean, oh, that's it, you're convicted and you've probably got a lesser sentence than if it had gone to trial, because people will enter guilty pleas for all sorts of reasons. Not necessarily because they've had a confession pressured out of them, but I do think that confession evidence is just one line of evidence, and we should be looking at everything else. And if it doesn't stack up, we shouldn't be paying attention to it.
Right, and Anonymous here asks a question where he takes this whole thing to its logical conclusion, or she, and asks, would it be practical not to allow confessions as a factor in the determination of guilt?
Would it be possible? I mean, I don't know really the ins and outs of trials, and I've not even been on a jury myself. I keep hoping that I will get called for jury service, and it's never happened. I don't know that we will ever get to a situation where confessions aren't considered. I think if confessions tally with other evidence, then that's something. But knowing that other evidence can be suppressed or doctored or chosen strategically, then it does beg a much bigger question. There'll be people far more knowledgeable than me that could answer what the likelihood of this ever happening is and what other complications it would cause. I don't think in my lifetime we'll see it.
Right. Are coerced or false confessions actually admissible in court?
Well, yes, because confessions are admissible.
Right.
And even if you can show that the person may have been persuaded by a line of questioning, and you can say, well, this person's been persuaded and the confession has been pressured out of them, it could subsequently be ruled inadmissible, but you can unknow something. So even if you've heard the evidence, even if the judge says, okay, that is inadmissible because we agree that it's coerced or pressured, the jury can unknow that information. It's already had an impact on them.
Didn't you say 87% of people who, where they were told it was inadmissible, still got convicted? I think that was the some high number like that.
Yeah, and then the jury will say, well, I was told it was inadmissible, so it didn't factor into my decision making. But the evidence is that it does. And actually, juries don't have a great insight into their own decision making. And being aware of something doesn't make you immune to it. So that's,
Right. So talking about confessions, Paul, aka Picticule, actually has a really interesting question. He says, has the incidence of false confessions diminished in the modern world with smartphones and their digital trail of text, photos and videos?
Oh, so getting back to the techie stuff, I don't know. They're thinking in terms of, well, the suspect would have proof that they didn't do it. Oh, there's fewer ways in which they might be tripped up. I don't know. I guess, yeah, if you've got your smartphone, then there's likely to be evidence that you weren't somewhere if you weren't there. So it's just another line of evidence to draw on, isn't it, I think? But I don't know what impact it's actually had.
I suppose it could help you say, if you were becoming convinced that you had done something you hadn't, you could get, oh yeah, actually I wasn't even there, because you got the evidence on your phone. So that might be. The next question is from, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just agreeing with you. Yeah, I'm thinking out loud.
The next question is from Chromium 52, and I think you did talk about this a little in the talk, but he's asking, or she, I'm not sure, is asking about recovered memory therapy and false confessions, and wondering what you think about what's your opinion on those. And he mentions specifically the Thomas Quick case in Sweden, who confessed to 8 murders under recovered memory therapy.
I would not advocate for recovered memory therapy.
Yeah. You did say, didn't you?
It's I mean, anything where somebody is even if they want to remember something, anything where a memory comes about through someone being in some sort of dissociative state or repeated imaginings, I am just really wary of those, because it is so easy to have false confidence that something happened, or genuine false detailed memories. So I'm very wary of that, and I wouldn't go for it.
Do we know how common it is to have detailed false memories?
I think detailed false memories, it's fairly low. So a lot of the research has used this kind of confidence that an event has or hasn't happened. And you say, well, becoming more confident that something happened doesn't mean you've got an actual memory for it. It just means you're kind of less certain it didn't happen, maybe. But some of that research was criticised for those reasons. And so other researchers said, well, actually, we want to try and get people to generate these details. So tell us who they were with when this happened, what date it happened, what had happened beforehand. I think it's a fairly small percentage, but still, even if it was 2 or 3 people in 100, that is a lot of people in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. And Dave J asks again about suggestibility. He says, is it the same thing that makes somebody suggestible as that makes people susceptible to hypnosis?
I can see how. I don't think suggestibility and sort of susceptibility to hypnosis are the same things, but I can see how they might have similar kind of underpinnings. It's also things like compliance and going along with a situation. So it may be more related to compliance than to suggestibility itself, but hypnosis definitely increases your suggestibility.
Right, and the next question's from Garnet, who asks, is there any form of standard review process for the sorry, my contact lenses are getting dry. I'm going to start that one again. Is there any form of official or standard review process for interview evidence or confessions to red flag possible false confessions before the court, or CPS? Is there anything to flag? Do we know it? Is there any way of knowing whether something's likely to be a false one?
I think realistically, it's not likely that every interview is reviewed. It's highly unlikely that every interview is reviewed, because we know what pressures police forces are under. And I think it would come about where only in cases where somebody, either the suspect said or the suspect solicitor or somebody said, actually, there was something untoward here, let's look at that. So I think there would need to be a prompt and then it would have to be reviewed. But as a matter of course, I doubt very much that is feasible.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that would require quite a lot more manpower than the police have got, isn't it, really?
Absolutely, yeah.
So the next question, somebody who I'm guessing must work for the NHS, because they've named themselves, my name is Steve, hello, sounds like the badge. He asks, 200 confessions to the murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. seems like an awful lot. Any explanation about why so many?
I think it was a mixture of factors, really. I don't know that there's information on, every case, but I think it was such a well-known case. It was so notorious that and there was kind of mass panic about it. I think there would have been a lot of people who just kind of wanted to be famous, who just who just wanted to who just wanted to be connected with the case in some way. I mean, it does seem like a really odd reason. You just go, well, who on earth in their right mind would volunteer the information that they'd killed a baby? Who would do that? Why would 200 people do it? But it's really difficult to understand.
Is that something that police forces, is it a problem that they have, people ringing in and say, oh, that thing that you asked for information about, it was me?
I don't think they're inundated with false confessions or false admissions of guilt. I think it's in high profile cases, it's much more likely. But then you get a lot more false leads in those cases anyway. I don't think it kind of happens in the day to day. I may be wrong. If there's any police officers on the call, feel free to tweet me and tell me I'm wrong.
Right. Right. Really interesting question from Anonymous. What sources would you recommend for further reading on this topic?
Oh, well, false confessions, there's only really kind of academic textbooks, but you can probably find some stuff on Google Scholar. So authors like Saul Cassin, who's listed in the slides, Gisli Gudjonsson, they are kind of the authorities, I guess, on this kind of thing. Also, information on how memory can be manipulated. So there's quite a lot of open access information about, memory manipulation. If you're interested particularly in kind of psychology in the law and coercion, I have a couple of recommendations. So this is a book called Unjustifiable Means by Mark Fallon, who was, I believe, a CIA agent. And this book documents some of the absolutely horrific things going on at Guantanamo Bay and at Abu Ghraib. So this talks about, goes into detail about the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques I referred to. And actually, ashamedly, some of the psychologists that were involved in developing some of these techniques. And secondly... Sorry.
Say the name again, just in case that hasn't been caught by the mods. I'm not sure.
The author is Mark Fallon, Fallon. So really fascinating book, Unjustifiable Means, but horrific. Sorry, he's a former NCIS special agent. It's really, I mean, I guess we all know in our head that this was happening, but it's really horrifying. And something else I would say is worth reading is books, you probably can't see it very well, books by The Secret Barrister. So The Secret Barrister's on Twitter. I don't have any background in law at all. And, I found this pretty horrifying. So this book is Stories of the Law and How It's Broken. I've read that one. Brilliant. I have the second book, but I've not got round to reading it yet. So those are two on my bookshelf that are immediately relevant to this area. But actually, if you're really interested, you're welcome to tweet me or to send an email to my institutional email address, and I will try and direct you in the direction of something kind of free to access and super interesting. I mean, it's all super interesting, isn't it? And frightening.
Yeah, the enhanced the first book you mentioned, I'm not sure. It's the kind of thing that you think you ought to read. I'm not sure I could bear it. And The Secret Barrister, yes, that is apparently on my shared Kindle, and I keep being told to read it. So
it's really good.
Yeah. We've saved a question till last. This is the last question. It's by Don, who is otherwise known as Steel Wolf, and he says, "G'day. I'm not going to do the rest of it in Australian accent, however tempting that might be. Do you watch any of the police procedurals and NCIS, CSI, CSI, Law and Order, that kind of thing? And are they far too close to reality, or far too removed from reality for you to enjoy?
I can still enjoy a drama. Those particular, I used to be a huge CSI fan. I watched the lot, and but I had a friend that worked in forensic science who told me this is absolutely ridiculous, and this would never, that thing they get done in an hour actually takes about 3 weeks. And of course, it's even worse now in the UK because this was gone back 15 years or so. So I kind of have to watch them with a healthy dose of reality suspension. But my husband will sometimes say, it's just pretend, Faye, you just have to let it go. It's for entertainment, it's not a documentary, because I can be heard shouting and swearing at the telly quite a lot, like on Coronation Street last night. That question's leading, Imran, and you know better. Just stop it.
I was just about to ask you if you ever found yourself shouting at the television.
Quite a lot, yeah.
Yes.
I know that it's not real, but I still can't quite, disconnect myself from it.
Right. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the questions then, and to the end of tonight's talk. So a huge round of applause, please, in our Twitch chat for Dr. Faye Skelton, who's given us the most engaging talk, and one which will send quite a few of us, certainly me, searching for more information. As I said, I'm geared up now for my arrest. So thank you very much for your help with that one. And thank you very much for a fascinating talk. Just as I say, 2 more reminders. Next fortnight, 2 weeks away from our next talk on deception in the 18th century. And if you want to look again in Twitch chat and head on over to our Lock-ins Razor for a drink tonight. I do apologise on Faye's behalf for the cats deciding to wander off, but another time. So once again, thank you very much.
You follow me on Twitter, I will post pictures of them.
We will. Thank you so much for that. Brilliant.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Cheers. Enjoy your drinks, everyone.
Thank you.